Good afternoon and welcome to this year's Terry Lectures. My name is Harold Attridge and I'm Professor of New Testament at the Divinity School and a member of the Terry Committee. The Terry Lectures have been an important part of the life of Yale University since they were endowed in 1905 by Dwight Harrington Terry of Bridgeport, Connecticut. The endowment for the lectures stipulates that they should foster the assimilation and interpretation of that which has been or shall be hereafter discovered, and its application to human welfare, especially by the building of the truths of science and philosophy into the structure of a broadened and purified religion. For over a century, the Terry Lectures have attempted to live up to that mandate. Our speaker today, Professor Anthony Appiah, born in London, read philosophy at Cambridge University, where he took his BA and PhD degrees. His early research dealt with issues in the philosophy of language and the philosophy of mind. Professor Appiah has had a distinguished academic career and has taught at Cornell, Duke, Harvard, and here at Yale. From 2002 to 2013, he was on the faculty of Princeton University, and since 2014, he has been professor of philosophy and law at New York University. He has an impressive array of philosophical publications, including Thinking It Through in 2004, The Ethics of Identity in 2005, Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers, 2006, and The Honor Code, How Moral Revolutions Happen, 2010. In addition to his work on philosophy, Professor Appiah has made significant contributions to the study of African and African-American literature and culture. His 1992 volume, In My Father's House, won the Anisfield Wolf Book Award, as well as the Herskovits Award of the African Studies Association. His interest in the field of inquiry continued through his 2014 publication, Lines of Descent, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Emergence of Identity. This truly impressive scholarly career has been recognized by Professor Appiah's membership in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and by several honorary degrees. His current interests explore some of the many ways in which we now think about religion, and that brings us to the topic of these Terry Lectures, whose general title is The Anatomy of Religion. This evening's lecture will be on gods and spirits. Tomorrow's lecture, also in this hall, will be on churches and symbols. The final lecture in the series, Religion After Darwin, will be held in the Whitney Humanities Center next Tuesday, April 25th. After the lecture, there will be a question and answer session for about 20 minutes. And following that, there will be a reception in the foyer, stage left. Please do join us there to celebrate this year's distinguished contribution to our venerable series. And finally, before we begin, let me remind you to turn off your cell phones and other beeping, chirping, or singing devices. And with that admonition, please welcome Professor Anthony Appiah.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. I was just thinking as I walked over here that the first lecture I ever gave in the United States was 30 years ago, I think, and it was on this campus. I am not now, nor have I ever been, a Muslim, a Jew, a Hindu, or a Roman Catholic. But I have feasted at Eid al-Fitr with my Muslim cousins, celebrated Seders at home with my in-laws, recited a Sanskrit mantra, and as I meditated alone, and attended a nuptial mass conducted by a cardinal. Through much of my childhood, I sang in an Anglican school choir in England, went to Sunday school during the vacations in an interdenominational church, dressed in my Sabbath finery in Ghana, and prayed each night before I slept, now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. My weekly recitations of the Nicene Creed was quite sincere, even if I've always had difficulty understanding how Christ could be of one substance with the Father. Those were at least resonant words. And like my Ghanaian Methodist father, I have poured libations to our ancestors, who were certainly once as real to me as the God whose presence I felt when I prayed. We would offer schnapps or whiskey or gin, whatever came to hand, to the founder of my father's lineage, the great warrior, Akramampim, Nana Akramampim, Bejin Sanum, Akramampim, our elder, come, take this alcohol to drink. As a child, I gained security from a gold cross that hung on a chain around my neck, which had been blessed by a spirit that spoke through the mediumship of a modest Scottish postman, who also reassured me by transmitting benevolent messages from my late English grandfather. So, as you can see, I was in touch with my British ancestors as well, and the magic in my life was bicultural, like my ancestry. Like millions of people, I've experienced the inward peace that comes from transcendental meditation, the sense of oneness with everything that is spoken of in contemplative traditions from around the world. But I felt the same peace too, sitting silently in the quiet of an English country churchyard in high summer. And once, at the end of a long season of training, rowing with my teammates in perfect concord on the Thames near Henley, when my body was working as hard as it ever has, I experienced what seemed to me like the same sense of communion with the universe. Then, as in the daily meditations of my teenage years, I felt, with the Blessed Julian of Norwich, who lived 6 centuries ago, that all will be well, and all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. Throughout recorded history, people around the world have believed in invisible spirits, sought mystical experiences, gathered in communal rituals, studied scriptures, lived daily lives shaped by a sense of things unseen, and had hopes and fears about the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns. And for at least a couple of millennia, there have also been skeptics who held with Catullus, living in the late Roman Republic, that nobis cum semel occidit grovis lux, nox est perpetua dormienda. For us, when once the brief light fades, all's night and a perpetual time for sleep. Catullus' Financiamento is more confident than the characteristically milder insistence of Horace, a generation later, who urged us not to ask, it is forbidden to know, what end the gods will give to you or me. In the ode that ends with perhaps his best-known line, Carpe diem nam minimum credula postero. And with that sense of an opposition between faith, with a perspective that is transcendent, eternal, or divine, on the one hand, and unbelief on the other, which gives urgency to the here and now, so we must seize the day, that sense of opposition is surely with us still. Grasp today, Horace says, put the least trust in the future. You'll find it unsurprising, I suspect, if I say that the prayers, the rituals and ceremonies, the beliefs and experiences I've been discussing, all at least, save Catullus' affirmation of the singular reality of the everyday world, deserve the epithet religious. I want to explore what that might mean. My approach will not be internal to any of the many traditions I have mentioned, from Roman and Hindu and traditional Asante convictions to the Abrahamic monotheisms. The Terry Lectures are supposed to address the ways in which, quote, science and philosophy inform religion. So I propose to reflect upon the thinking of social scientists who've used an idea of religion in their work. Like many intellectuals, believers and unbelievers alike, I am fascinated by theology, but I will largely hope to avoid religious metaphysics. My questions are external rather than eternal, questions that should interest anyone, whether or not they themselves claim to be religious. What in our social lives can appeal to religion and religions explain? This question, too, is an old one. Lucretius, in the first book of the De Rerum Natura, tells the story of the ritual sacrifice of Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia, as the Greek fleet sets off for the Trojan War. This harrowing passage, describing a beautiful princess dressed as for a marriage celebration, slaughtered on the altar by her father's hand, ends with a celebrated couplet. Exitus ut classi felix faustusque daretur, tantum religio potuit suade malorum. All this for fair and favourable winds to sail the fleet along, so potent was religion in persuading to do wrong. The English word religion, which has cognates in many European languages, derives from this Latin word, the word Lucretius uses, religio. Cicero, the Roman philosopher, lawyer and politician, writes about religio too in the middle of the 1st century, before the Common Era, in his On the Laws, and in a way that will seem relatively familiar to us. It involves belief in the Roman gods, sacrifices at temples under public regulation, and worship of the ancestors and the household gods on shrines at home. It is a source of moral authority and provides a basis for law. Something like the common sense idea of religion is quite old in Europe, therefore. But so is criticism of religion, as the passage from Lucretius, written about the same time as Cicero's book, demonstrates. Lucretius assigns responsibility for the evils there to religio, and implies that religio leads to evil again and again. But what does it mean to assign to religion the power to explain this or anything? And does he mean all religions, or just the particular religion that motivated Agamemnon? Modern social science is the creation of theorists who explored the role of religion in many areas of social life, giving it, like Lucretius, an explanatory role. So my aim in these lectures is to examine some of what they were doing. Sociology and anthropology proposed from their very beginnings a scientific study of religion. I want to focus on attempts to understand religion in this scientific way, which is something relatively new. What would that entail? And at the end, I'm going to take the rise of the social science of religion as itself something worth trying to understand. That'll be in the 3rd lecture. The idea of religion figures in European and North American social sciences today in many ways. Here are just 3. First of all, religious labels can reveal important contours of social life. So what your religion is can figure as, in the jargon, an independent variable in the description of social patterns. A sociologist might notice that Catholics are less likely than Protestants to divorce. In a similar way, religious identities can be the dependent variable, as when we notice that women are more likely than men to convert to the faith of their spouses. Here we can explain why someone has the religious identity they do in terms of other features of their situation, their gender, their marital status, or the religious identity of a spouse. Religious identities, then, can figure as one subclass of social identities, and like other identities, religious ones are associated with other socially interesting properties. Noting patterns like these can lead one to an interest in a second kind of inquiry. One can treat religious beliefs or practices as the explanandum, as what we are trying to explain. How did belief in invisible deities develop in a certain society, or in many societies? Why do so many American evangelical Christians oppose Darwinism, while Catholics are more likely than not to believe in evolution? That is, more Catholics believe in evolution than don't believe in evolution. Or one can, at least that's what they say, or one can take religious beliefs or practices as given and ask why people with those beliefs or committed to those practices have certain other socially interesting properties. Here religion serves as the exponans, the thing that does the explaining. The 20th century German sociologist Max Weber famously thought both that capitalism arose in societies where people had certain Protestant beliefs and values, and that in thinking about the content of that form of Protestantism, we could come to understand why. And finally, one can classify religious identities, beliefs, or practices, and then notice and seek to explain patterns across religions. The fundamentalisms project of the last few decades aimed to characterize fundamentalist versions of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on, and to ask whether something explained their development in recent times. All of these sorts of explanations, these questions, raise philosophically interesting issues. What sort of concept is religion? Is it a local or a universal one? What's the right account of it? What conceptions are presupposed in various approaches to social theories about religions? What relation should there be between sociological accounts of religion, on the one hand, and the accounts of adherents of religions, on the other? I'll begin by looking at the classical canon of anthropology and sociology of religion in the works of Sir Edward Tylor, Max Weber, and Emile Durkheim, who all died towards the end of the second decade of the 20th century, two of them in 1917 and one in 1920. They were concerned both to develop a conception of religion that was usable in making comparisons across a wide range of cultures and to articulate social scientific theories of the nature of religion, its function, its effects, its historical development, its role in social and in economic life. I start today then with Tylor's account of religion, which is the earliest and can be found in his great work, Primitive Culture, published in 1871. This is the book that entitles him to be regarded as the first cultural anthropologist, and it made his reputation, gaining him the academic stature that led to his eventual appointment in 1896 as the first professor of anthropology at Oxford University. In the next lecture, I'll discuss Durkheim and Weber, in each case focusing mostly on a single major work, Durkheim's Les Formes élémentaires de la vie religieuse, the elementary forms of religious life, and Weber's discussion in his Religionssoziologie, in the large text Economy and Society, the magnum opus published in 1922, 2 years after his death. Tylor was raised as a Quaker, Weber's family were Calvinists, and Durkheim was the son and grandson of rabbis. Between them, these three people, an English Quaker, a German Calvinist, and a French Jew, laid the foundations of the modern social science of religion. In the final lecture, I'll explore some recent work in evolutionary psychology that aims to explain how various features of religions developed historically. We'll see that evolutionary psychology, too, focuses on the very elements that were central in the work of these three founding fathers. And at the end, if you'll permit me, I'll draw some conclusions of my own. Sir Edward Burnett Tylor came from a prosperous English Quaker business family, and in 1855, in his early 20s, he left his homeland for the New World. Riding on horseback through Mexican towns and countryside, visiting Aztec ruins and dusty pueblos, Tylor was impressed by what he called, quote, the evidence of an immense ancient population. Tylor's extensive account of his Mexican travels was published in 1861 when he was back in England. It was called Anahuac, which is the Aztec name for Mexico. And his Mexican sojourn lit in him the fires of an enthusiasm for the study of faraway societies, ancient and modern, that lasted the rest of his life. A decade later, he published his masterwork, Primitive Culture, the product not of more field work, but of long labour in the library. And that book can lay claim, as I say, to being the first work of modern anthropology. It's to Tylor more than anyone else that we owe the idea that anthropology is the study of something called culture, defined as, I quote, that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, laws, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. Tylor's framework is fundamentally evolutionary. He's interested in primitive culture because it is human culture at its earliest stage of development. The 1873 German translation of the book was called Die Anfänge der Kultur, the beginnings of culture. As he says towards the book's start, the thesis which I venture to sustain within limits is simply this, that the savage state in some measure represents an early condition of mankind out of which the higher culture has gradually been developed or evolved by processes still in regular operation as of old. If this is your general thesis about culture, your account of religion in particular will start with the savage state, looking among contemporary savages for a reflection of how religion was in the earliest human societies. Because we'll be spending much of these lectures in Tylor's company, let me warn you that we need to get used to his use of words like savage and primitive, and to his condescension to what he called the lower races from other societies around the world. In seeing these living contemporary cultures as reflections of the human past, Tylor was representative of the thinking of his place and time, where civilization was a process in which every society could be placed somewhere on a scale from a barbaric antiquity to a civilized modernity. Civilization, as I say, was a process, not a state, and societies were largely advancing with occasional setbacks in the same direction. But we shouldn't make the mistake of condescending to him for his condescension. He was a powerful, creative thinker, formed, as we all are, by his own society, but able sometimes to see further than most of his contemporaries. And perhaps sometimes farther than we can. Primitive culture begins by discussing this evolutionary framework, exploring through it the nature of magic, the development of language, and the invention of arithmetic. Only after nearly 300 pages does he turn to issues that are central to the study of religion, but these take up the rest of the nearly 1,000 pages of this two-volume work. For better or worse, Tylor's great contribution to the social science of religion, is his theory of animism. A chapter entitled Animism is followed by 6 more entitled Animism Continued. As he says at the start, more than half of the present work is occupied with a mass of evidence from all regions of the world, displaying the nature and meaning of this great element of the philosophy of religion. That's animism. Yet, oddly enough, he doesn't turn to a systematic account of animism until chapter 11. What you might think of, you and I might think of as religion, shows up long before this, however, in particular in the 3 chapters on mythology. Mythology continued, and mythology continued, where Tylor says of the earliest phases of culture, which he saw as represented in the present in many contemporary societies in every continent from Lapland to New Zealand, that its denizens live in an enchanted world. Quote, to the lower tribes of man, sun and stars, trees and rivers, winds and clouds, become personal animate creatures leading lives conformed to animal or human analogies. Still, it's only later, in the final chapter of the first of the 2 books of primitive culture, that he turns to his theoretical account of animism, and here we come to see what Tylor understands is the core of religion. And this is where he offers his first and famous, quote, minimum definition of religion as, quote, the belief in spiritual beings, capital S, capital B. This definition may seem clearer than it actually is. For looking through the hundreds of pages of Tylor's compendium of examples, his spiritual beings are a motley crew. Many Confucians believe, as I did when young, in ancestral spirits. The Romans had their Manes, the Lares and Penates, the household gods. But Romans also believed in nature spirits, nymphs and satyrs, as well as in Jupiter and Venus and the other Olympians, and the hundreds of gods named in the Indigitamenta, the priestly list of gods that they kept in Rome. The Maori, on the other side of the globe, have Maui, who played a leading role in Tylor's book long before he was discovered by Disney to star alongside Moana. But they also have a sky god and an earth goddess and gods of the sun, sea and stars, of peace and war, beings with evocative names, Ranginui, Tanganora, Rongo and Tu. They have nature spirits as well, identified with trees and lakes and mountains. Many Jews have believed not just in Yahweh, but also in golems, creatures made from animated mud. Christians traditionally believe not just in Christ, but also in demons. Orthodox Muslims believe in Allah, of course, but also in jinn, of whom only one is well known in our North Atlantic world, again courtesy of Disney, as the genie of Aladdin's lamp. But in all of the Abrahamic traditions, you will find people who worry about ghosts and have faith in angels. If, as Tylor clearly thinks, all these are ways of believing in spirits, and spirits are so diverse, don't we need to say something about what, conceptually speaking, they all have in common? Indeed, since some atheists say that we human beings are spiritual beings, shouldn't we worry that Tylor's account will make those atheists religious too? Here is Tylor's preliminary answer to this question. The theory of animism divides into 2 great dogmas. forming parts of one consistent doctrine. First, concerning souls of individual creatures capable of continued existence after the death or destruction of the body. And second, concerning other spirits upward to the rank of powerful deities. So I think the proposal is that the core notion is the notion of the soul, an entity that animates humans and maybe some other creatures. And Tylor says, in looking for a conception of the soul in an alien culture, as anthropologists of religion must, they are looking for belief in something that provides an answer to two questions. In the first place, what is it that makes the difference between a living body and a dead one? What causes waking, sleep, trance, disease, death? In the second place, what are those human shapes which appear in dreams and visions? So the central claim encoded in the definition of religion as belief in spiritual beings is that religion involves extending belief in the human soul, which accounts for the animation of a living body, in two conceptual directions. First, we develop the idea that what animates us can live outside our body and finally outlast it. That's the human soul. And second, we suppose that there are other entities in the world that are soul-like. These two extensions, then, of a life force that can escape the body as a ghost and of souls into the non-human world, together produce, in Tylor's scheme, the idea of a spiritual being. Quote, spiritual beings are held to affect or control the events of the material world, and man's life here and hereafter, and it being considered that they hold intercourse with men and receive pleasure or displeasure from human actions, the belief in their existence leads naturally, and it might almost be said inevitably, sooner or later, to active reverence and propitiation. Thus, animism in its full development includes the belief in souls and in a future state, in controlling deities and subordinate spirits, these doctrines practically resulting in some kind of active worship. Once one has belief in spirits, then, with powers over aspects of the world, worship, one aspect of the practice of religion, is just a natural human response to those with whom we hold intercourse, those spirits. Just as we placate people who have power over the things we care about, so we propitiate spirits. The belief is primary. Once we have belief, practice can be seen as the reasonable reflection of it. In extending souls into the wider world, we generate naturally a system of quasi-social relations beyond the world of living human beings. Tylor's evolutionary framework leads him to start with this basic idea, arguing that societies elaborate it in various directions, producing in what he called the higher stages of culture more sophisticated elaborations of the basic schema. But he thought that in primitive religion, in the earliest stages of religion everywhere, each human body was associated with two things: a life force on the one hand, and a phantom on the other, visible as our shadow, surviving us as our ghost. Quote, these two are evidently in close connection with the body, the life as enabling it to feel and think and act, the phantom as being its image or second self, but also are perceived to be things separable from the body, both of them, the life as able to go away and leave it insensible or dead, the phantom as appearing to people at a distance from it. It's an easy step from here, Tylor thinks, to identifying the life force and the phantom to produce the idea of the human soul. There are ethnographic reasons to doubt Tylor's suggestion that these two functions are not naturally combined into one entity, as indeed there are, I should say now, reasons to doubt many of his claims about primitive society. Weber, as we shall see, thought the evidence here about this topic suggested otherwise. Certainly, Ashanti, where I grew up, kept the two functions, the life force and the phantom, distinct. Each person's body was associated with two distinct spiritual agencies, one, the Kra, being responsible for the distinction between the living and the dead. It came into you, brought life, and left when you died. And the other, the Sunsum, which can travel in dreams and return as a ghost. And by the way, where I grew up, it's the phantom that thinks and acts, not the life force. Similar ideas occur in other West African cultures and no doubt elsewhere. Still, even this case fits with Tylor's basic idea that there are two distinct questions to ask about the life force and the phantom. What's the difference between the living and the dead, and what is it about people that can travel and do things far away from their bodies? Under the influence of Descartes, you may be tempted to suppose that spirits like these must be immaterial. But Tylor's examples show that this is not so. Spirits don't have to be material, let alone invisible. You can see a shadow, and even when they escape our senses, they can interact in other ways with the material world. Indeed, Tylor gives a cosmopolitan compendium of cases from around the world of traditions in which the soul is represented as a material substance. Quote, the Tongans imagined the human soul to be the finer or more aeriform part of the body, which leaves it suddenly at the moment of death, something comparable to the perfume and essence of a flower as related to the more solid vegetable fibre. The Siamese conceive of souls as consisting of subtle matter, escaping sight and touch, or as united to a swiftly moving aerial body. To be able to escape the body is not to be immaterial, which is why ghosts can act in the physical world, even though they can also sometimes pass through walls. The extension of souls beyond humanity goes far beyond their ascription to animals and plants, which, like human beings, can pass from life to death, and so may need a life force to explain the difference, as it does as we need an explanation for the difference between life and death in humans. For many things, including artifacts like knives or spears, can have spirits too. And some of the principal spirits, as with the Maori, inhabit lakes and mountains, the sun and the stars. Tylor gets closer to an account that covers all of the thousands of cases he examines in primitive culture when he says, speaking more abstractly, spirits are simply personified causes. Taking up this suggestion, later followers of Tylor, like Sir Edward Evans Pritchard, who followed him as Professor of Social Anthropology at Oxford in the mid-20th century, have argued that in religious belief, as in the natural sciences and in folk theories of the world, what we see is the postulation of entities to explain the phenomena of experience. Building out from their understanding of human beings, animated material creatures able to act on physical objects guided by their beliefs and their purposes, our ancestors projected a theory that was wildly successful in predicting and understanding each other onto a much wider world. Religion begins, Tylor and the Tylorians have argued, when we extend that theory to other things, animal, vegetable and mineral, natural and artificial, that we discover or make in the world around us. Demons and deities, then, are of the same essential nature as souls, just as the souls of animals and plants are of the same essential nature as human souls. And because souls can live either independently or in human, animal, or other bodies, spirits can live either free or embodied too. Tylor cites a passage from Milton's Paradise Lost that indicates the pervasiveness of spirits in the worlds of the many cultures he discusses. Millions of spiritual creatures walk the earth unseen, both when we wake and when we sleep. Milton wrote. Now, Tylor presents this belief in spirits as a perfectly natural response to early human experience of the natural world. He does not think that our ancestors are to be condemned for it. We could say, in a modern philosophical idiom, that Tylor's primitive men and women adopted what Daniel Dennett, the American philosopher, has called the intentional strategy, and I quote from him, treating the object whose behavior you want to predict as a rational agent with beliefs and desires and other mental states, exhibiting what Brentano and others call intentionality, where that's the property of being about something. It's just that they did this projection of the intentional strategy so over a much wider range than many of us now think is warranted, and they based their appeal to these quasi-psychological states in the belief that they are the capacities of a sort of spiritual, which does not mean immaterial, substance. We should recall, in deciding what we think of our ancestors, that we still apply the intentional strategy to things, such as our pets, that are not human. So, using the vocabulary of the contemporary philosophy of mind, Tylor's claim is that the core of religion is the application of the intentional strategy to a substance widely instantiated in the non-human world. I think this will seem surprising to many contemporary people in our North Atlantic cultures, since many of us would be likely to think that the core of religious belief is not in spirits but in gods, perhaps only one of them. After all, this is presumably what leads people to contrast religion on the one hand with atheism on the other. What atheism denies, etymologically speaking, is that there are gods. Tylor anticipates this objection. A Dr. Lang, he says, has claimed that Australia's Aborigines, quote, have nothing whatever of the character of religion because they have no idea of a supreme divinity, creator and judge, no object of worship, no idol, temple or sacrifice. But Tylor, in response, cites authorities for the view that Aborigines believe that smallpox is the work of Budya, an evil spirit who delights in mischief, and that they, quote, have definite traditions concerning supernatural beings, Bayame, whose voice they hear in thunder and who made all things, Turamulam, the chief of demons, who is the author of disease, mischief and wisdom, and appears as the form of a serpent. So he's claiming that Aborigines have religion because they have spirits. They don't need gods to qualify. Now, even though Tylor uses the word God with and without an initial capital G, as well as deity and divinity in the earlier parts of primitive culture, he only turns to a theoretical discussion of deities towards the end of the chapters on animism. And that's precisely because gods are for him only one of the kinds of spiritual beings that are at the heart of religion. Quote, man so habitually ascribes to his deities human shape, human passions, human nature, he says there. We ascribe to the deities not just a soul like ours, but our form, our sufferings, even our physical shape. So that if this is right, the deities are not the spirits that humans, are just the spirits that humans think are most like us. A tree spirit need not have a human form. Its concerns are, so to speak, arboreal, not human. Perhaps it is incapable of love or fear. Still, its soul is, in its general operation, like ours. But the gods that Tylor had discussed in his chapters on mythology, Zeus or Odin or Maui, can be imagined as like human beings. Even if they exist sometimes outside a body, they can take on our form and our feelings, be irascible, love and hate. And like us, they can have social relations with one another, even have, like us, a kind of politics. Quote, among nation after nation, it is still clear how man being the type, that is the prototype of deity, human society and government became the model on which divine society and government were shaped. As chiefs and kings are among men, so are the great gods among the lesser spirits. They differ from the souls and minor spiritual beings, which we have as yet chiefly considered, but the difference is rather of rank than of nature. This suggestion runs in a different direction from the earlier proposal that the divinities are just the anthropomorphic spirits, because now the distinction between gods and other spirits is, in essence, that the former are the aristocrats of the world of spiritual beings, as it were, from top dogs to top gods. This makes a problem for Tylor when he turns to the Abrahamic monotheisms, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. For if the one God is, so to speak, the monarch of the spiritual world, there are other spiritual beings beyond mere humans in most of the monotheisms that keep him company. In the Anglican prayers of my childhood, we joined the angels and archangels and all the blessed company of heaven to laud and magnify his glorious name. These too were spiritual beings. So what in this scheme is the real distinction between monotheism and polytheism? Tylor anticipated this objection and gives this longish answer. If the monotheistic criterion be simply made to consist in the supreme deity being held as creator of the universe and chief of the spiritual hierarchy, then its application to savage and barbaric theology will lead to perplexing consequences. Races of North and South America, of Africa or Polynesia, recognizing a number of great deities, are usually and reasonably considered polytheists. Yet under this definition, their acknowledgement of a supreme creator, of which various cases will here be shown, would entitle them at the same time to the name of monotheists. To mark off the doctrine of the lower races, closer definition is required, assigning the distinctive attributes of deity to none save the Almighty Creator, capital A, capital C. So he's noticed the problem, but in the end he never tells us what the distinctive attributes of the deity actually are. So we're left only with the thought that at least in the earliest forms of religion, there are aristocrats of the spiritual world which have personalities more or like those of actual people, and that those are the gods. I'll return to the issue of the appeal to the Almighty Creator there in the final lecture. Tylor treats the adoption of the intentional stance towards things that lots of modern people would say have no mental states as a natural feature of human thought. But human beings have explanatory schemas available other than the intentional stance. We understand certain events, the breaking of a tree limb by the wind or by a person, say, as causal processes explicable without appeal to the will or the beliefs or the emotions of the tree or indeed of the wind. If a branch doesn't break when we bend it, we know we must press harder. Everybody understands the push and pull of efficient causality. People have the idea as well that some things have functions, that hearts are for pumping blood, knives for cutting. Dennett calls this latter explanatory strategy the design stance, and it too is available across societies, precisely because our species is homo faber, the maker, and design is one of our characteristic activities. In the contemporary world, with the rise of a scientific approach, we can give many more detailed causal explanations, allowing for much more successful prediction and control than was possible in earlier societies. Darwinism allows us to explain how functions can arise without appeal either to agency or to design. And when things happen in the world around us, we moderns often turn naturally to an explanation neither in terms of agency, not that is by way of the intentional stance, nor in terms of design, but just in terms of natural causality. Why did our ancestors so often do otherwise? So I'll return to that question, why we humans have applied the intentional strategy to so many things other than ourselves, in the final lecture. But I want, in closing today, to note two absences from Tylor's account, which we will be able to fill out next time. Many of us, whether raised within one of the many religions that live in our country or outside them all, are likely to feel that in his explanations of the religious lives of people around the world, via the character of the spirits in which they believe, Tylor makes too little of the role of intense emotion. The few references to emotion in Book 1 occur in a discussion of emotional and imitative language. They have nothing to do with religion. Only in Book 2, at the end of the last of the chapters on animism, does Tylor observe that he has kept, quote, the intellectual rather than the emotional side of religion in view. Yet, he says, he concedes, even among the rudest savages, religious life is associated with intense emotions, with awful reverence, with agonizing terror, with rapt ecstasy. Recognizing this, Tylor admits, some will complain that he has, quote, written soullessly of the soul. Well, he says, that was his plan, because as he sees it, the core of religion among primitive peoples was animism, his great discovery, and scientific progress is at times most furthered by working along a distinct intellectual line. Yes, there is emotion there, but it is belief in spirits, not feeling, that really matters. It's tempting to suggest that Tylor was misled here by his own religious upbringing among 19th century Quakers, for whom sitting for long periods in silence constituted the dominant liturgical form. Or you might lay the blame at the door of his upbringing as an Englishman with a stiff upper lip. Either fact might account ad hominem for the absence of emotion in his story. But of course, if the world is full of spirits, which, like people, have, as it were, hearts as well as minds, there is no reason to think that animism deprives us of the resources to predict and explain the role of emotion in religious practice, since, after all, a great swathe of human emotion consists precisely of our responses to other people. That Tylor doesn't talk much of religious emotion does not mean that his theory cannot encompass it. For belief in creatures with minds something like ours provides a quite reasonable basis for an emotional response. In a final chapter, before his conclusion, Tylor turns from belief to practice, discussing rites and ceremonies. And those of us who have participated in the ceremonial life of the Abrahamic religions, or Hinduism or Jainism, say, might have expected to find some discussion here of the sorts of intense emotions one can witness or experience in such ceremonies. But at this juncture, too, Tylor attends mostly to their cognitive rather than to their emotional or affective dimensions. In discussing, as he does, such topics as prayer and sacrifice, or what he calls fasting and other methods of artificial ecstasy, he focuses first not on the feelings experienced or expressed, but on the goals pursued. Prayer, which is, quote, the address of personal spirit to personal spirit, is, quote, simply an extension of the daily intercourse between man and man. Well, only for a man in Victorian England, you might think, would that rule out emotion. Tylor sees prayer as, above all, a matter of making requests for what he calls personal advantage. The paradigm here is not the personal address that begins the Christian Lord's Prayer, Our Father, which art in heaven, nor the blessing of his name, which continues it, hallowed be thy name, not even the hope that thy kingdom come, thy will be done, but rather the peremptory, give us this day our daily bread, which comes after all of them. But he has to grant that even in savage religion, prayer can be a means of strengthening emotion, sustaining courage, and exciting hope. He recognizes then that when we talk to the gods, as when we talk to one another, we're not simply making demands, but experiencing the sentiments that grow out of relationships. It may be that we can't imagine a profound relationship with the tree spirit, though Keats, who spoke of the nightingale as the light-winged dryad of the trees, might rebuke us for this failing. But when we are dealing with the more richly realized psychology of personal gods, our interactions can be personal rather than instrumental, valued, that is, for the experience of the other itself. In many of the cases he discusses, from Samoa to Zululand, prayer is accompanied by an offering, that is, with forms of gift or sacrifice. Here, too, he sees that, as with gifts between human beings, there is the possibility of offerings that express love or respect without expecting anything in return. Is the gift-giving of Christmas or Hanukkah or Diwali an act of propitiation aimed at gaining personal advantage? Probably not. In fact, Tylor might have offered a general explanation of the existence of ritual and ceremony in our relations with the gods, for in all societies, relations between people are mediated by ritual and ceremony. Just as he could also have explained the appeal of prayer not as the instrumental manipulation of spirits, but as having the rewards of communion with another person, so the natural ceremoniousness of our relations with other humans can account for the centrality of ceremony in our encounters with the gods. The general point is that the animist hypothesis provides much more scope for an exploration of religious ritual and communion with the gods than Tylor actually gives us. He doesn't give his own hypothesis, I think, a full run for its money. There's another great absence in Tylor's treatment of primitive religion, one that you might think goes with the absence of feeling. Primitive culture seems remarkably unattuned to the role of religion in shaping the ethical life of its adherents, by which I mean its role in the enforcement of norms and in their creation and their content. Tylor's defense here is that he's focusing on primitive religion, on the origins of religiosity, and he believes that, quote, savage animism is almost devoid of that ethical element for which the educated modern mind is the very mainspring of practical religion. Now, Tylor's imperial condescension to savages, as to our ancestors, whose religions he saw revealed in the life of our primitive contemporaries, does not, despite appearances, extend to denying them any access to moral ideas. Far from it. He insists, to the contrary, that morality is not absent from the life of the lower races, because human society requires it. Without a code of morals, he wrote, the very existence of the rudest tribe would be impossible. And indeed, the moral standards of even savage races are to no small extent well-defined and praiseworthy. But these ethical laws stand on their own ground of tradition and public opinion, comparatively independent of the animistic beliefs and rites which exist beside them. Well, as I'll show in the lectures that follow, others have seen this as one of Tylor's most important errors. But it's an empirical claim. It's an empirical claim that animism is a sort of freestanding set of beliefs, independent of the moral lives of the societies in which it occurs. Tylor does turn, then, finally, as I've said, to the ritual or ceremonial side of religion, which would figure, as we saw at the start, alongside belief and community in most contemporary North American common sense about religious life. He treats both prayer and ceremony, as means of intercourse with spiritual beings. But what the religious agent is usually doing in Tylor's story is, in his words, as directly practical as any chemical or mechanical process. Doctrine and worship correlate, he says, as theory and practice. Tylor's view is that once we understand religious belief, religious behavior will make sense as the instrumental pursuit of goals people already have. But he doesn't think of religion, as so many of us might, as giving us things to aim at. After all, though it's only because they believe there is a world... though it's only because they believe that there's a world of spiritual beings beyond this world and after life that people aim at getting there, and only because the gods command it that certain practices are required or forbidden. Tylor does concede that ritual and ceremony involve, quote, expressive and symbolic performances, the dramatic utterance of religious thought, the gesture language of theology, but these are ways of recording and communicating belief, or of swaying the spirits we believe in. The drama, the gesture, are epiphenomena of the beliefs they express. In the works of the great sociologists of religion I want to consider next, both ritual and community play a much more central role, and the social meaning of religion extends far beyond the consequences of belief in spiritual beings into emotion and ethical life. But let's concede that Tylor demonstrated, with an astonishing range and depth of ethnographic materials from the human past and around the world, that a great deal of what we call religion can indeed be understood by seeing it as the projection of agency into the cosmos. In focusing, as he put it, on a distinct intellectual line defined by the theory of animism, the hypothesis that religion is at its heart belief in spirits, Sir Edward Tylor delineated one paradigm for the scientific study of religion. Thanks very much.
We have about 20 minutes for questions. That last question is coming to the microphone. Ms. Allen.
Hi.
So you were using the intentional stance to interpret Tylor, but you ended by saying that Tylor thinks that insists that religious belief explains religious practice. Now, one thing Ryle and Dennett don't go for is a big distinction between belief and practice. So they reject, and they certainly reject the idea that there's some inner state of belief that explains practice. So that suggests a very sort of non-Dennettian, non-Rylean way of thinking in Tylor.
Yeah, I think that's right. I was just using that to... I mean, when people do the thing that Dennett describes as adopting the intentional stance, they mostly do think of themselves as assigning beliefs to people, and that's really Tylor's point. So you could have thought that people were kind of clear that this was some kind of metaphorical thing. I think Tylor doesn't think that's true about the cases that he's mostly considering, which are ethnographies of what he called primitive people. So material both about the ancient practices of Europeans and about the contemporary practices of sort of less developed communities.
Right, it seems quite important to not use the intentional stance there because an atheist can go along with the practices and not have the
right, yes. So maybe it's not helpful. I mean, I just think that the idea that I sort of tried to finesse this by saying that it was a combination of the intentional stance with the projection of a substance grounded. That's what I was thinking of when I put those weasel words into that sentence. So I agree that he's not suggesting that they were thinking about it in the way that Dennett does. What I was suggesting is that he's thinking that they're doing what Dennett thinks people are doing, only when people actually do it, they mostly, unlike Dennett, think it's an important question whether the states are actually there. And they mostly, I think if you ask them, would say that they think they are. And Dennett sometimes says that he thinks they are too. It's not entirely clear to me, as you know, since you've read stuff I've read stuff of yours and you've read stuff of mine about this. I mean, I think it's a bit unclear what the official position ought to be. So I should be clear that this is not. There are other views according to which it's metaphor, and people understand it as metaphor. They understand that it's, or perhaps an idealization. It's as if there were spirits out there, but really, you know, push comes to shove. If you insist, I'm going to say, well, not really. He's not supposing that. He's supposing that the projection of this explanatory structure is motivated by the thought that there's a substance out there which warrants it. And that's, for him, at the heart of... And as I say, he got these 2 volumes which go through scads of material, taking out slightly surprising things and showing that you might be able to think of them as explained in that way.
We have a religious studies department, and we have a divinity school. And it seems that gives us a choice. In one case, we can subordinate religion to science. And in the other case, we can look at other religions and determine how they're different from the truth, right? Whereas in religious studies, we're bracketing the whole question of truth in that sense. Is it possible to avoid that choice of either subordinating religion to science, in which case you're really sliding toward a physicalist ontology that doesn't allow for life force more than an emergent property, doesn't allow for life beyond mortality and so on, versus a situation where religion is subordinating science and is considering science itself a belief system competing with other religions.
That is the topic of the last half of the 3rd lecture. So I agree it's a really important set of questions, but I don't really want to... It'd be hard to say what I want to say without going through the middle part of the argument, as it were. So yes, I think it's a really important question, and I mean, I think I've always thought there's a genuine tension here, and the question, so I'm going to talk about what you've talked about, though I'm going to use an expression that's sometimes used, methodological atheism. I'm going to ask some questions about where that comes from. I don't believe, so the short answer to your question is, I don't believe it has to come from a metaphysical rejection of theism. You can motivate methodological atheism by something other than atheism, in other words. And that's what I want to discuss.
Yes, thank you, Professor Appiah, for that wonderful expose. Your comment that some Catholics are more likely to believe in evolution than some Protestants struck me, because I've been doing a study on a personal basis, sort of trying to match language in the Bible with sort of a symbolism for some theories, scientific theories in physics and the new cosmology. Maybe I'm jumping ahead to your 3rd talk. I'm just wondering, to what extent in your work are you incorporating some of the more recent discoveries of physicists and the new cosmology? Because, I mean, even though I grew up in the Catholic tradition, I used to say that I do not believe in a personal God. I believe in the God of Einstein. But after doing some studies on the new physics, I'm now thinking that I believe in the God of string theory, because it incorporates the Trinity, the Catholic
Well,
Trinity.
So I think, I believe that string theory is what a Catholic would call a mystery in the strict sense. That is something whose truth one has to take on faith, whose intelligibility one has to take on faith. There's mysteries, which are things whose truth you have to take on faith, and there's mysteries in the strict sense, which are things whose intelligibility you have to take on faith. So it's not surprising that someone tempted by the doctrine of the Trinity should be tempted by string theory, in my view. But so I don't talk about that because what I set out to do was to think about the sort of religious studies, the sociology and anthropology of religion, and those people are mostly not interested in trying to see in, Aboriginal totemism truths about the deep physics of the universe. If it were the case that an Aboriginal religious person made a claim of that sort, then of course the sociologists of religion would immediately be interested in it, but they wouldn't be interested in it in terms of its truth value. They would be interested in terms of the fact that people believed it. But it is an important fact that, for example, that if you ask the question, do you believe in evolution by natural selection, more Catholics say yes than no, right? I mean, that's just a fact about the Gallup poll. You could interpret it in lots of different ways, but that's a fact. I didn't bring them in the next lecture for various reasons. I will have notes about the numbers here if you're interested in them, but I didn't bring them with me today. So one of the interesting things about contemporary Christianity, I think, is the range of relations between the views people have about religious metaphysics and their general views in metaphysics. And there are just many, there's sort of every possible combination, it seems to me, from, the old joke about Unitarians, that they believe in at most one God, through to people who are trying very hard to work out a picture which is consistent with the best modern cosmology and the best modern physics, but holds on to parts of this, or in principle, all of the story properly interpreted in the account of creation in Genesis. So it seems to me all of those are there, all of those different positions are there. And so a sociologist of religion has to take account of that fact, has to be able to explain how it's possible. And notice that Tylor is in a very poor position to give an account of that Unitarian, right? Because if you believe in at most one spirit, there's the possibility that you don't believe in any spirits, and then you can't be a religious person from Tylor's point of view, which would come as news to a lot of Unitarians who are busy living religious lives without that doctrine. So I think you need to, any plausible account of the concept of religion is going to have to include, I believe, people who are not Tylorian religionists, who are not animists, who don't believe in spirits at all. Just because that's, as it were, that's what's in the range of the concept as we now use it.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to ask maybe about kind of two study cases that don't seem to me to fall on the camp of religion, but that seem to fall on the camp of religion by kind of the account that we get from Tylor. So, and see maybe what the options are for Tylor to account for them. So one kind of case I'm thinking is just like way far back, where like people like Aristotle, Neoplatonists think that to account for the movements of the stars and of the planets, we need to think that these are beings that have souls in a sense relevant to the way in which we have souls. And the other test case is kind of more modern. It's someone like, Chalmers just thinks like this is like a possibility that we need to take seriously to account for consciousness. We might consider that panpsychism might be the best option.
Yeah.
And I guess it doesn't seem like these are going to be cases of religion. And I was wondering, I was thinking of two kind of options. So one was kind of what you mentioned at the end that Tylor doesn't go into, which is kind of this emotional connection or the practices that go with it, which don't go attached with these cases. And the other was sometimes you hear something like, well, there's a difference in kind of like methodology. So these are people that are using like rational methods to get at these beliefs, whereas like religious people are not using rational methods, but that gets really complicated with things like natural theology and so on. So I was wondering how you think the best way to account for kind of these cases are from kind of like a Tylorian standpoint. Thank you.
Good. I think that Tylor, well, first of all, his real interest is in, it's called Primitive Culture, the book. He's interested in how it all starts. He's clear that as time goes on, starting from this, other things can get added in of the sort that I'm going to talk about tomorrow through Weber, the development of complex institutions. And certainly, I think Weber is in a position to say that though the sort of later developed stages of religion may have started with this stuff, they don't need to, they don't need to hold on to it. So that, sorry, this is the answer. This is an answer to the opposite question, which is can you have religion without spirits? Your question is whether can you have spirits without religion? I think the answer. I mean, I don't want to tell you what my answer is to that question because that's lecture 3. But but I think Tylor would be happy with the conclusion that what we find in Aristotle is a reflection of Greek religion. And that even though there are rational arguments, there are rational arguments to be made about, all the major traditions. And there's Al-Ghazali's God, and then there's the God of the ordinary, everyday Muslim. And so I don't think, indeed, it's hard to see how we can understand what the proposal is, except by analogy with ideas that are derived, in the Greek case, from Greek religious ideas. Now, panpsychism, this is at the end of a very long trail, which goes, among other things, by way of Descartes, whom I mentioned briefly, in which a philosophical notion of the soul is developed, which is, I would say, no closer to the sorts of ideas that Tylor was talking about than the physical conception of the cosmos that physicists have is to the conception of the cosmos that was in those early religious accounts. So they have roots, but both our notion of the planets and so on has roots in, they've got the same names as they had in the Old Testament. We know how to translate references to the planets in the Old Testament or in the New, or in the Quran. So I think he would say, my main task in this book was to talk about how it all begins. I grant you that in the process of civilization, that process through which you develop from these earlier forms of thought into later ones, all sorts of things can happen, and this is history, so there's contingency in it, and so on. And I think he would probably. I mean, he doesn't have a good answer to the question: is the spirit of the panpsychist what I'm talking about? Because he doesn't, as I suggested, have a very good answer to the question: what makes something a spirit in the first place? Apart from the fact that it operates according to that it operates as if it had beliefs and desires and other psychic states. In that sense, the sort of Leibnizian panpsychism is very much, I think, consistent with what Tylor thinks is going on. But he doesn't have to treat Leibnizianism as a religion, because, as I say, for that you have to think about the history and where things come from. But it's these examples are good examples to hold in mind, because I think I have an answer to the question, but it's not Tylor's.